The first quilt appeared on a Tuesday morning in October of 1883, folded neatly against the door of the little sodden timber building at the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, and Maggie Bell nearly tripped over it in the blue-gray dark before sunrise when she stepped outside to fetch water from the barrel. She stood there in the cold, her breath a small cloud dissolving into the frozen air, and she looked down at the quilt with the expression of a woman who has learned to be suspicious of gifts she cannot account for. It was a heavy thing, stitched together from squares of buffalo hide and thick wool, the kind of work that took months and knew exactly what it was for. It was not decorative. It was not dainty. It was the warmest thing Maggie Bell had seen in 2 years of living on the Kansas plains, and it smelled of pine resin and wood smoke and something else, something clean and wild that she could not quite name. She picked it up and carried it inside and draped it over the small iron cot where her youngest patient, old Jeremiah Potts, was shivering through a chest cough that had already taken 2 men that season in the camps east of town. She tucked it around him and went back to her work, and she told herself she would find out where it came from before the week was through. She did not find out before the week was through. Because the next morning there was another quilt, different this time, pieced from elk hide and some kind of dark flannel, just as heavy and just as well made. And the morning after that there was a third, and by the time Maggie Bell had enough quilts to keep every one of her 4 patients warm through the first hard freeze, she had started watching the darkness outside her window in the early hours before dawn, trying to catch whoever was leaving them. Maggie Bell was 26 years old and she had come to Caldwell alone, which was a thing people still talked about. She had trained under a physician in St. Louis named Dr. Amherst, who had been old enough and wise enough and unusual enough for his era to teach a woman everything he knew. She had arrived in Caldwell in the spring of 1881 with a leather bag of instruments, a crate of medicines and tinctures, 3 medical textbooks she had read until their spines cracked, and absolutely nothing else. The town had not known what to make of her. The men had been skeptical. The women had been curious and then grateful, because Maggie Bell was good at what she did in a way that could not be argued with once you had seen her work. She was not a large woman, but she was not small in the ways that counted. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned up while she worked and let loose at night, and gray eyes that people sometimes described as silver when the light caught them right. She had strong hands from 2 years of hard work, and she had a direct way of speaking that made some men uncomfortable and made others, the better kind, quietly respect her. She had her own building now, given to her by the town council after she had successfully treated a diphtheria outbreak that might otherwise have gutted half the town. It was small and it was drafty, and in the winter the wind came through the walls like it was visiting, but it was hers. The cold season in Caldwell that year came early, and it came hard. By the first week of November the temperature at night was dropping below 10 degrees, and the wind off the open plains had a character to it that felt almost personal, as though it had decided specifically to test the people who had chosen to build their lives in this place. Maggie Bell kept her fire burning all night when she had patients, which was most nights, and she wore 2 wool skirts at once, and still felt the cold in her bones when she made her rounds before sunrise. The quilts kept coming. Every single night, without fail, regardless of whether the temperature was brutal or merely cold, regardless of whether it was clear or whether a blue norther was rolling in off the prairie and turning the world to white noise. She would wake in the small hours and there would be nothing at her door, and then she would wake at first light and there it would be. Whoever was doing it was quiet, more than quiet. They moved through the night without disturbing the dogs at the livery 2 lots over, without waking the light-sleeping widow Carruthers who lived in the house directly across the road and who claimed she heard everything. Maggie Bell began asking around. Carefully, because she did not want to embarrass whoever it was if they had reasons for the anonymity, but persistently, because she was a woman who needed to understand things. The blacksmith duly shrugged his large shoulders and said he hadn't heard anything. The barkeep at the Silver Spur, a man named Cord who knew most things that happened in Caldwell before they had fully happened, gave her a long considering look and said the name Hugh Turner. She had heard the name. Everyone in Caldwell had heard the name. Hugh Turner was a mountain man, which was a category of person that had been somewhat displaced by 1883, but which still existed in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. Men who lived in the high country or in the deep timber and came down into town only when they needed supplies, or when the winter drove them in from the truly remote places. Hugh Turner came down from the Flint Hills, which were not mountains in the way the Rockies were mountains, but which were wild enough and isolated enough to count for this purpose, and he was known in Caldwell the way a landmark is known, as something large and permanent that you oriented yourself around without necessarily engaging with directly. He was 32 years old, Cord told her, or thereabouts, because nobody was entirely sure of the exact number, including possibly Hugh Turner himself. He had come to the Flint Hills from somewhere in Tennessee when he was a young man, and he had never entirely come back. He trapped and hunted and knew the land in the way that only comes from years of solitary attention. He came into town 3 or 4 times a year, bought what he needed, fixed whatever needed fixing on the tools he carried, sometimes helped a family whose wagon had broken down or whose well had caved in, and then he went back to wherever he lived, which no one who was not Hugh Turner had ever precisely located. He was big, Cord said, looking at Maggie Bell with the faint amusement of someone who knows they are telling a woman something she might find inconvenient. Big the way that men who spend their days doing genuinely hard physical labor are big, not the performance of it but the reality, with shoulders that looked like they had been designed for a door frame 2 sizes larger than standard, and arms that in their muscle density spoke to years of carrying and hauling and climbing, and fighting the landscape on its own terms. He had dark brown hair that ran past his collar because nobody was going to tell him to cut it, and a beard that was full but not unkempt, and eyes that Cord described as being the color of the hills in November, which Maggie Bell thought was a more poetic description than she had expected from a barkeep. She had not yet met him face to face. She had seen him once at a distance, crossing the main street in the early morning on one of his supply runs, and she had registered him the way you register weather, as something requiring assessment and possibly respect. He had not looked her way. She decided to thank him. This seemed like the right thing to do, not to interrogate him or make the thing strange, but simply to acknowledge what he was doing, because what he was doing was keeping her patients warm, and in at least one case she was fairly certain it was keeping old Jeremiah Potts from following his neighbor Sturgis McRae into the next world. She wrote a note, brief and direct. Mr. Turner, I believe I owe you my thanks. The quilts have been a considerable help. Yours, M. Bell. She gave it to Cord to pass along the next time Hugh Turner came in, and then she went back to work. 2 days later she found a note under her door, not tucked under the door like a letter would be, but slid under it from outside in the night so that she found it on the floor in the morning. The handwriting was careful, the kind of handwriting of a man who had not written much but who took it seriously when he did. It said, Miss Bell, glad they are of use. The cold season is not finished. H. Turner, that was all. It was not a lot of words, and yet she read it 3 times. She thought about Hugh Turner more than she meant to over the next week. She thought about the fact that someone had noticed her situation, had assessed what she needed, and had simply provided it, night after night, without being asked and without requiring acknowledgement. She thought about what it said about a person that they would do that, would spend the weeks before winter making quilts heavy enough and warm enough to do real work, would walk in from wherever they lived in the cold dark before dawn, and would leave them and walk back without making a sound. She thought it said something quite particular about that person. She also thought, though she would not have admitted this to anyone, about those shoulders. The first time she properly met him was in the 3rd week of November, on a Wednesday, when a man from one of the homesteads 8 miles east of town came in with his arm broken in 2 places from a horse that had gone badly wrong, and his 2 friends who had brought him in were not going to be of much use in holding him steady for what Maggie Bell needed to do. She sent word to Cord at the Silver Spur because Cord sometimes had men around who could be relied upon, and 20 minutes later her door opened and Hugh Turner walked through it. He had to duck slightly to clear the frame. That was the first thing she noticed, because the frame was a standard height, and the fact that he needed to consider it told her everything about the scale of him. He straightened up inside her clinic and looked around with dark eyes that took in everything quickly and calmly: the patient, the instruments laid out, Maggie Bell herself, and he said, "Cord said you needed someone with steady hands." His voice was low and even, not loud the way some large men's voices were loud, as though they felt they needed to fill space. It was a voice that had spent a lot of time in quiet places. "I do," Maggie Bell said, and she looked at him directly because she always looked at people directly, and she saw that he was exactly what she had been told and also somehow more than that, because descriptions, even good ones, could not entirely capture the quality of stillness that came off this man, the sense of someone who had made peace with hard work and hard country, and was simply present in the way that a mountain or a river is present, without apology or performance. "I need you to hold his shoulders and keep him from moving when I set the bone. It will hurt him badly and he will try to throw you off. Don't let him." Hugh Turner looked at the injured man, who was sweating and gray-faced on the table, and he nodded once and moved to the head of the table and placed his hands on the man's shoulders. And the hands were exactly what Cord had not quite been able to describe: large and calloused and sure. And when Maggie Bell did what she needed to do and the injured man surged and cried out, Hugh Turner held him as still as though he were holding a fence post, without visible effort, his face calm and focused. When it was done and the arm was splinted and the man was breathing more steadily and his friends were helping him out into the wagon, Hugh Turner stepped back and wiped his hands on his coat and looked at Maggie Bell, and she looked at him, and there was a moment that was longer than it needed to be. "Thank you," she said. "That was well done." "You did the work," he said. "I couldn't have done it properly without someone keeping him still." He nodded, acknowledging this without making anything of it. Then he said, "The weather is turning worse tonight. You have enough wood?" She blinked at the shift in topic. "I believe so. I'll bring more, stack it by the south wall." He said this as a statement of fact, the way a person tells you the sun is setting, without any suggestion that it required her input. Then he looked at her again briefly, as though measuring something, and said, "You're doing good work here, Miss Bell." He left before she could formulate a response that felt proportionate to what he had said, which was not a flowery compliment but which somehow meant more than one would have been. That night she heard, faintly, the sound of wood being stacked outside, and in the morning there was a cord of wood against her south wall that she had not had before, and a fresh quilt on her doorstep, this one made from soft tanned deer hide lined with wool batting, the finest one yet. She stood in the cold morning holding it, and she felt something shift in her chest, something that she had kept carefully still for 2 years of solitary work, and she recognized it with the same directness she brought to everything else, and she thought, well, December came in like something that meant business. The cold in Caldwell in December of 1883 was the kind of cold that the old-timers talked about for 30 years afterward, the kind that froze the water in your pitcher overnight and made the timbers of your building crack and groan, and turned the main street into something that might as well have been the surface of the moon. Maggie Bell had 7 patients by the second week of December, some with frostbite and 2 with the bad chest sickness that was working through the town's poorer households, and she barely slept. Hugh Turner began coming by during the day as well, not intrusively, not in a way that complicated her work, but practically the way he did everything. He appeared one morning to repair a section of her roof where the cold had worked a plank loose, and the wind was getting in above the patient's corner. He appeared another morning to reinforce the door seal with strips of oiled leather that he cut and tacked with the precise economy of a man who had been maintaining things in harsh conditions for 15 years. He carried water when she was too busy to leave her patients. He chopped wood and stacked it, and sometimes he sat in the chair by her door in the evenings, and did not ask for anything or require entertaining, but simply was there in the way that a fire is there, providing warmth by existing. They talked during these times, when there was a lull or when the work allowed it. Not the careful talking of two people trying to impress each other, but the gradual, easy talking of two people discovering that they are interested in the same world. He told her about the Flint Hills, about the way the tallgrass prairie rolled away into the distance in the high country, and about the animals he knew by name and behavior, the deer trails that ran like writing through the brush, the hawks that he had watched long enough to recognize individually. She told him about St. Louis and about learning medicine from Dr. Amherst and about the specific satisfaction of knowing something precisely, of understanding the mechanics of a body well enough to help it pass the things that were trying to stop it. He listened to her in a way that she was not entirely used to, completely and without interruption, as though what she was saying mattered to him. She found herself talking longer than she intended, saying things she had not said to anyone, about how she had chosen this work not because it had been expected of her, which it certainly had not, but because she could not imagine doing anything else, because the idea of a person suffering from something that could be addressed if only someone knew how and was willing to try seemed to her like the central problem of human life. He sat with that for a moment, and then he said, "That's why you came out here. Not because the towns back east were too small, because out here there's more of that problem." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "exactly." He nodded as though this confirmed something. She asked him about the quilts in early December properly now that they were talking directly. She asked him why he had started, what had made him think of it. He was quiet for a moment in the way that she was learning was not evasion but genuine consideration. He was not a man who said things before he meant them. "I came through in early October," he said, "on a supply run. I walked past your building in the morning and I heard you talking to a patient inside, and through the window I could see you had no fire going yet because you hadn't had time to start one. You were wearing your coat indoors and you were still working." He paused. It was 30 degrees that morning. She did not say anything. "I didn't like it," he said simply. "I thought about it all the way back to my camp. Then I started making quilts." She thought about a large man alone in the hills, cutting and sewing by firelight, planning the dimensions and weight of each quilt with care, thinking about whether it would be warm enough. She thought about him walking in before dawn, the 5 miles or however far it was, in whatever weather was happening, to leave it at her door and walk back. She thought about him doing this every single night for weeks without saying a word. "Hugh," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and she felt him register it, though he did not react outwardly. "That is one of the most generous things anyone has ever done for me." He looked at the fire in her small stove. "It wasn't generosity," he said. "It was necessity." She thought about that word for a long time after he left. A complication arrived in the 3rd week of December in the form of a man named Preston Hale, who rode into Caldwell with 2 companions, and a reputation that Cord conveyed to Maggie Bell in a series of careful warnings. Preston Hale was a land speculator and something slightly uglier than that, a man who had made a habit in several Kansas towns of identifying what he wanted and applying varying degrees of pressure until he got it. What he wanted in Caldwell appeared to be the building that housed Maggie Bell's clinic, which sat on a lot that was, according to the deed he produced at the town council meeting, technically still in dispute following the death of the man who had granted it to her. Maggie Bell attended the council meeting and argued her case with the same directness she brought to everything, and she made a good argument, but Preston Hale had money and lawyers in Wichita, and the deed situation was genuinely complicated in the way that land titles in frontier Kansas often were, where the paperwork had been done quickly and sometimes carelessly during the boom years of settlement. The council was sympathetic and uncertain, which was not the same as helpful. Hale came to see her personally the next morning, arriving at her door with his hat in his hand, and a smile that she did not trust from the first moment. He was a smooth man in his late 30s, well-dressed for the territory, with the practiced charm of someone who had learned that charm was a tool. He offered her money, more than the building was worth by any reasonable assessment. He told her he thought what she was doing was admirable, and he had no wish to disrupt it. He would simply like to use the lot for a different purpose, and surely she could find suitable premises elsewhere in town. She told him she would think about it, which was not agreement but which she intended as a way to buy time to understand her actual options. Hugh Turner appeared at her door an hour after Hale left. She had not sent for him, and she asked him later how he had known, and he said he had seen Hale's horses at her post and he had waited nearby until they left. She found this both touching and slightly alarming, the protectiveness of it, and she told him as much, and he looked at her steadily and said, "You can tell me to stay out of it." "I'm not telling you to stay out of it," she said. "I just want you to understand that I'm handling it." "I know you are," he said. "I thought you might want someone standing behind you while you do." She looked at him for a long moment. The winter light through her small window made his face sharp and clear, the jaw set, the dark eyes watching her with that quality she had come to know as care, not the soft, apologetic kind but the hard, certain kind, the kind that meant he would be there when the thing got difficult. "All right," she said. He was not at the second meeting because she told him she needed to handle the council herself, and he understood and respected that distinction. But he was outside when she came out, standing in the cold in his long coat with his arms crossed in a way that made him look roughly the size of a barn door. And when Preston Hale and his two companions came out behind her, Hale saw Hugh Turner, and something shifted in Hale's expression, something careful and reassessing. Hugh Turner did not say anything to Hale. He looked at him the way he probably looked at weather systems rolling in over the hills, with complete awareness and complete calm. And Hale, who was a calculating man, and therefore a man who knew the difference between someone performing threat and someone being it, made a small decision visible in his posture and turned away and spoke to his companions about something else. He left Caldwell within the week, which Cord said had something to do with another property dispute in Dodge City that required his attention, but which Maggie Bell thought had more to do with the fact that Preston Hale had looked at Hugh Turner and understood that the building he wanted was not, regardless of what any deed said, something that was going to come loose easily. The land title was eventually resolved in January through the intervention of a judge in Wichita who had been one of Maggie Bell's patients the previous spring, and who owed her rather more than he would have cared to advertise, and the building was confirmed as hers, and that chapter closed cleanly. But December was still December, and it was still very cold, and Maggie Bell still had patients and still had work, and Hugh Turner was still there every morning with a fresh quilt at her door and every evening in the chair by her fire, and somewhere in the long middle of the month something changed between them, or perhaps something that had already changed simply became visible. It was a night in the third week of December when old Jeremiah Potts took a turn for the worse, the chest cough deepening into something that made Maggie Bell move quickly and precisely through her entire supply of remedies, the camphor poultice and the elecampane tincture and the careful management of his breathing. And Hugh Turner was there because he had brought wood and had stayed because she was worried and he could see it. And he stayed through the night, sitting in the corner out of her way and handing her things when she needed them, and keeping the fire exactly right so the air in the room stayed warm and humid the way she said it needed to be. Around 3 in the morning, when Jeremiah's breathing had finally steadied, and Maggie Bell had straightened up from his bedside and pressed the back of her hand to her eyes for a moment in a gesture that was not quite tears but was the aftermath of sustained fear, Hugh Turner was there, and he put his hand on her shoulder. Just that, just the weight of it, and she leaned back against it for a moment and let herself be held up by something other than her own will. "He's going to be all right," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not entirely dry. "Yes," Hugh Turner said, looking at the old man's chest rising and falling. "He is." She turned around then, because the hand was still there and she wanted to see his face, and she looked up at him, and he was closer than she had realized, or perhaps she had realized, and that was why she had turned. His face in the firelight was open in a way she had not seen before, the habitual reserve of it gone, and she saw that he was looking at her the way she had been trying not to look at him, with everything visible. "Hugh," she said. "Maggie," he said, and just her name in his voice, low and serious and certain, undid approximately 6 months of careful professional composure. And she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he covered it with his own large hand. And for a moment they simply stayed there, and then he bent his head slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. And she did not change her mind, and he kissed her once gently, and then again less gently. And she thought that nothing in her considerable experience of hard work and hard winters and hard country had quite prepared her for the specific warmth of that. They drew back and looked at each other, and she laughed a little, not from nerves but from the sheer unexpectedness of joy, and he looked at her with that new openness on his face and said, "I have been thinking about doing that since October." "Since October," she said. "Since the first morning I left the quilt, I couldn't stop thinking about you." She shook her head slowly, smiling. "You could have knocked on the door." "I wasn't sure you'd want me to," he said. There was something in his voice then that she had not heard before, something younger and less certain than the capable man who held injured men still and repaired roofs in December. And she understood that Hugh Turner, who was afraid of very little that the physical world offered, had been afraid of this. "I would have wanted you to," she said. Jeremiah Potts slept through all of this, which was either fortunate or disappointing depending on your point of view. Christmas came to Caldwell the way it came to frontier towns in 1883, without a great deal of ceremony but with genuine feeling. The families gathering in the small church that the town had built 2 years prior, and the children hanging whatever they had from the mantelpieces, and the general understanding that, in a place this remote and this cold, the fact of being together at all was the celebration. Maggie Bell treated a frostbitten rancher on Christmas morning and was at the church by noon, and when she arrived, she found Hugh Turner already there, sitting in the back pew in the way of a man who is used to being in the back of things, wearing a coat that was clean and mended and looked like he had given it some thought. He had made her a gift. He gave it to her after the service in the cold outside the church, handing it over in the way he did most things, without fanfare, as a fact. It was a small carved wooden box, sycamore wood, with a clasp made from a piece of hammered brass, and on the lid he had carved with enormous care and some real skill a rendering of a hawk in flight over tall grass prairie. She turned it over in her hands in the cold and felt the precision of each carved line under her fingertips. "Hugh," she said. "It's for your instruments," he said. "The small ones. The ones you carry in your coat. I thought they'd keep better." She looked up at him, and she thought about a man alone in the hills in the evenings, carving wood by firelight, measuring the dimensions of a box he had calculated would fit the instruments he had once watched her retrieve from her coat pocket. She thought about all the things he did like that, the careful private provision, the attention to what was needed before it was asked for. She stood up on her toes, which was still not quite enough, and he understood what she intended and bent down, and she kissed him in the cold outside the Caldwell church on Christmas Day in 1883, while the last of the congregation filed past and tried with varying degrees of success not to stare, and she felt him smile against her mouth, a rare and precious thing. January was worse than December in terms of temperature, but easier in terms of everything else, because by January Maggie Bell and Hugh Turner had stopped pretending that their arrangement was anything other than what it was. He was at her clinic every day now, sometimes helping and sometimes simply present, and she had stopped qualifying this to herself as practical, and had started acknowledging it as what it actually was, which was that she wanted him there. He had started staying later in the evenings, and the conversations between them had deepened into the particular intimacy of two people who have found that the inside of the other person's mind is exactly as interesting as the outside. She learned the shape of his history in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by walking through it over time. He had grown up in the hill country of eastern Tennessee, the son of a farmer who had worked the land hard and loved it genuinely, but who had been unable or unwilling to understand why his second son could not stay still within the borders of a farm. Hugh Turner had come west at 17, first to Missouri, and then following the movement of game and opportunity further into the territory, learning as he went the skills that kept a man alive in country that did not care whether he lived or died. He had been in Kansas for 11 years. He had never married. He said this carefully, watching her face, because he had never met anyone who made him want to stop moving. He paused and then said, in a tone that was not quite asking and not quite stating, "I've stopped moving." She looked at him across the small table where they were eating the stew she had made from the venison he had brought, and she said, "I know." He had not been without the company of women entirely. He told her this honestly and without apology one evening when they were talking about the shape of their lives before each other. But there had been nothing that had lasted, nothing that had taken root, and he described this without drama, as a fact of the life he had lived. She told him with equal honesty that there had been a man in St. Louis who had courted her seriously and who she had cared for genuinely, but who had, ultimately, wanted a wife who would stay in St. Louis and be a wife, and that this had been an irreconcilable difference. Hugh Turner listened to this and said, very quietly, his loss, and then, after a moment, my gain. It was in the second week of January that the question of where Hugh Turner actually lived came up practically rather than abstractly. A particularly vicious storm had rolled in off the prairie on a Tuesday afternoon, and by nightfall it had become a genuine blizzard, the temperature dropping to 20 below and the wind driving sheets of ice horizontally across the plains. And Hugh Turner, who had come in that afternoon with a deer, and with the look of someone who had read the weather correctly and planned accordingly, was at her clinic and showed no sign of leaving when the storm became fully itself. "You'll stay," she said. This was not a question. "I had thought I'd head back," he said, but he said it as something offered for her consideration rather than an actual intention, because they both knew that heading back to the hills in a 20 below blizzard was the kind of decision that put men in frozen ditches. "You'll stay," she said again. He stayed. He took the chair by the fire because her two remaining patients, Jeremiah, who was recovering, and a young woman named Clara whose baby was due in 3 weeks and who had been having a difficult time of it, were on the cots. Maggie Bell sat with him for an hour after her patients were settled, watching the fire and listening to the blizzard make its case against the walls of her building, and she felt the quality of his presence beside her, the solidity of him, the warmth. "When spring comes," she said, without quite planning to say it yet, "what will you do?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That depends." "On what?" He looked at her steadily, those November-colored eyes serious and warm at once. "On whether you'd be willing to do something particular." Her heart did something she chose not to analyze in the moment. What particular thing? He reached into his coat and produced a length of leather cord from which hung a small carved ring, sycamore again, worked so smooth and tight that it would not give. He had clearly made this some time ago. He held it out to her and she looked at it and looked at him, and she felt the whole weight of what he was offering, not just the ring but everything it meant, the permanence of it, the declaration of it. Hugh Turner, who had stopped moving, holding out a carved ring in the firelight while a blizzard tried the walls outside. "Maggie Bell," he said, "I would very much like you to be my wife, if you'll have me. I know I'm not much for towns, and I know my life is rough around the edges in ways yours doesn't have to be, but I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you don't regret it. I would make a good husband. I know how to take care of things." She thought about that last sentence, understated and sure, and she thought about every quilt left in the dark before dawn, every cord of wood stacked against her wall, every night he had stayed in a chair by her fire to make sure she was not alone with her fear, and she thought that if there was a better definition of knowing how to take care of things, she did not know what it was. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Hugh, I'll have you." He put the cord over her head so that the ring rested against her sternum, and she put her hand over it, and he put his hand over hers, and they held it there between them for a moment. And outside the blizzard raged, and inside the fire burned steadily, and Jeremiah Potts slept, and Clara the pregnant young woman smiled quietly in her cot, because she had not been asleep at all. In the morning, when the storm had blown itself out, and the world was white and still and very bright, Maggie Bell walked to the Widow Carruthers across the road and told her, because Widow Carruthers would know within 24 hours regardless, and Maggie Bell preferred to be the source of her own information. And Widow Carruthers pressed both of Maggie Bell's hands in her own dry, warm ones and said, "That man has been in love with you since October. Anybody with eyes could see it." And Maggie Bell said, "I know. I was catching up." Word spread through Caldwell with the particular velocity of frontier town news, which was to say it had reached the far end of the main street before the morning was half over. Cord at the Silver Spur shook his head with the satisfaction of someone who had seen this coming from the moment. He first said the name, and went to pour himself a drink. The blacksmith duly clapped Hugh Turner on the shoulder hard enough to move a smaller man, and said something to him in a low voice that made Hugh Turner grin, an event so unusual that Dooley later reported it to 3 separate people. The wedding was in March, because Maggie Bell had patients who needed her through the cold season, and because Hugh Turner was a man who understood that the work came first, and who would not have wanted it otherwise. They were married in the same small church where he had given her the carved box on Christmas Day, with Cord and Widow Carruthers and Clara, who had delivered her baby boy successfully in February with Maggie Bell's help, and a good portion of the rest of Caldwell in attendance. It was a clear March day, cold still but with the first quality of spring in the light, that particular brightness that says the worst is past and something else is coming. Maggie Bell wore her best dress, which was blue, and she had her hair down, which she rarely did in public. And when she walked up the aisle of the small church and saw Hugh Turner standing at the front in a coat that was clean and his hair brushed back, his large hands hanging at his sides, watching her come toward him with an expression that was entirely unguarded, she felt that the 2 years she had spent working alone in the cold building at the edge of Caldwell had been building to exactly this moment. This specific man, and this specific look on his face. He held her hands during the ceremony, and she could feel him trembling slightly, not from cold and not from doubt, but from the magnitude of it, and she held his hands more firmly, and he steadied. When the words were said, and the thing was done, he kissed her, once seriously, and then he smiled that rare smile, and she laughed, and the congregation made a noise that was the frontier equivalent of a standing ovation, which was to say that Cord let out a shout, and Dooley stamped his feet, and Widow Carruthers wept in a pleasant way, and several people who had not been invited came in through the back door to see what the noise was about. They had been discussing where to live, which was a genuinely interesting problem. Maggie Bell had her clinic and her town and her patients. Hugh Turner had his hills and his land and his way of life. Neither of these things was optional. They were both essential to who each person was, and so they had talked about it at length, that January and February, with the same directness they brought to everything. What they arrived at was both practical and something more than that. Hugh Turner began building a proper house, not a camp or a cabin, but a real house, 5 miles from the edge of Caldwell, close enough that Maggie Bell could be in town in an hour by horse when she needed to be, far enough to have the land and the space and the quality of quiet that Hugh Turner had always needed to be himself. He knew how to build. He had been building things for 15 years in places where the materials and the techniques needed to be right, or the consequences were immediate. He built it from limestone and timber, with walls thick enough to hold heat, and a roof that he spent 3 days on to make sure it would not give under the weight of snow, and windows positioned to catch the light through the long winter days. Maggie Bell contributed the floor plan, specifically insisting on a room large enough to be used as a secondary examination space for patients who could not make it to town, which was more of them than people might expect, and Hugh Turner built it without argument, and in fact made it larger than she specified, because if there was one thing he had learned about Maggie Bell, it was that her estimates of what she needed were conservative. They moved in late April, after the last frost, into a house that smelled of new timber and limestone dust and the particular freshness of spring on the Kansas plains. They stood in the main room together on the first evening, Maggie Bell with her arms crossed looking at the proportions of the place and Hugh Turner watching her, and she turned around and said, "It's beautiful, Hugh." He looked at her rather than at the room and said, "Yes." She understood that he was not talking about the room, and she smiled. The life they built in the house in the first year was a good one, full in the way that lives are full when two people are genuinely compatible rather than merely accommodating each other. Hugh Turner's days still took him out into the hills and the deep country, trapping and hunting and knowing the land in the way that was fundamental to him. But he came home at night, and the coming home was something he had not expected to want as badly as he discovered he did. Maggie Bell's days took her to the clinic in town, several times a week, and sometimes to outlying farms and homesteads when she was needed, and she came home to the limestone house and to Hugh Turner's cooking, which was considerably better than her own because he had been feeding himself from wild ingredients for 15 years and had developed actual skill. She was not a woman who would have accepted a man managing her work or making decisions about her professional life, and Hugh Turner was not a man who would have tried. What he did instead was provide everything around the work, the warm house and the stocked larder and the maintained property, and the steady presence that meant she never came home to cold or darkness or emptiness. He understood that the work was her, not something separate from her, and he tended the life around it the way he tended the land, with patience and knowledge and care. In September of 1884, she told him she was expecting. He was sitting at the table cleaning a trap when she said it, and he put the trap down carefully and looked at her, and she saw his face do something she had no previous reference for, because it was Hugh Turner's face doing something entirely new, a kind of wild, quiet joy that he had apparently not prepared any expression for. He stood up and crossed the room and picked her up off her feet, which she was briefly indignant about on principle, and then she felt his arms around her and heard him breathing against her hair and felt the slight shake of his shoulders and thought that being briefly indignant about being lifted was entirely beside the point. "A child," he said, "just that." "A child," she confirmed. "Spring, I think. April." He set her down and held her face in his large hands and looked at her for a long moment. Then he said with great seriousness, "I am going to reinforce all the window frames." She laughed so hard she had to sit down. He did reinforce all the window frames. He also added a room to the house over the course of October and November, building it in the same limestone as the rest, with a small fireplace of its own, so the baby would have its own warmth. And he built a cradle from walnut wood that Maggie Bell thought was possibly the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He would not let her do anything heavier than she needed to, which was a source of some friction, because Maggie Bell's definition of too heavy and Hugh Turner's definition of too heavy were significantly different, and they had 2 or 3 discussions about this that were heated enough to be interesting and resolved in the way their disagreements always resolved, with each of them genuinely hearing the other and arriving at something they could both live with. The cold season of 1884 came around again, and this time Maggie Bell watched her husband prepare for it with the same thorough attention he had once brought to making quilts in secret, checking the wood supply and the seals of the clinic building in town, and the warmth of their own house with systematic care. She told him one evening, watching him bank the fire with the particular competence that still made her feel something warm behind her sternum after a year of watching him do it, that she thought the night he had left the first quilt at her door was the beginning of everything. He looked at her from across the room. "I know," he said. "I thought about that every single morning on the walk back from your building. I thought, this is foolish, she doesn't know you exist, just knock on the door." He paused. "I couldn't do it, not yet." "Why not?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "Because," he said, settling back in his chair with the quality of patience that was one of his most fundamental characteristics, "leaving the quilt meant you were warm. Whether you ever spoke to me or not, whether anything ever came of any of it, you were warm." That was enough to start with. She thought about that for a long time, the essential Hugh Turner of it, the man who would provide warmth regardless of whether anyone knew it was him, regardless of any possibility of return or reward, because someone he had noticed was cold, and that was not something he was able to tolerate. She had thought she knew what kind of man he was, back in those first months, but she kept discovering that she had underestimated the depth of it. "Hugh," she said. "Maggie," he said, with the small private smile she had come to understand was entirely hers. "Come here," she said. He came. The baby arrived on a Saturday morning in late April of 1885, which was about 2 weeks later than Maggie Bell had calculated, and he arrived at some considerable speed once he made up his mind, so that Maggie Bell barely had time to send word for the midwife from town, a competent older woman named Mrs. Forsyth, before it was very nearly too late to need her. Hugh Turner was there throughout, because Maggie Bell had said firmly and clearly from the beginning that she wanted him there, that he was not to be sent out to pace in the barn like men in stories, that she wanted his hands and his steadiness, and he had said with complete simplicity, "Then I'll be there." He was there. He was everything she had asked him to be and more. When it was done, and Mrs. Forsyth placed a red-faced and loudly opinionated infant boy in Hugh Turner's arms, the large hands receiving the small weight with a care so precise and careful that Mrs. Forsyth, who had seen many a man hold his firstborn child, found she had to look somewhere else for a moment. Hugh Turner looked at his son and said nothing at all for a long time. He just looked. Maggie Bell, tired and elated and watching her husband's face from the bed, thought that she would carry the image of that moment for the rest of her life. Hugh Turner standing in the morning light of the new room, holding their son against his broad chest with the same hands that had once held injured men still and stacked wood in the winter dark. His face entirely open and entirely unguarded, something lit behind those November eyes that had no name she could think of except what it was. They named the boy James after Maggie Bell's father, who had been a good man and a gentle one and who had died when she was 15. And Hugh Turner agreed to this with immediate sincerity and said, "James Turner. That's a fine name," and she thought he was right. James Turner proved to be a person of strong opinions from the very beginning, which was either his mother's influence or entirely his own nature, and he grew through that first year in the limestone house with the specific vigor of a child, whose two parents are both, in their different ways, accustomed to making things work in hard conditions. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, which people later said was an arresting combination, and he had a way of studying the world around him with complete seriousness that was recognizably Hugh Turner in miniature. In the fall of 1885, Cord retired from the Silver Spur and sold the place to a man from Wichita, and before he left, he came out to the limestone house to say goodbye, and he sat at their table and drank the coffee that Maggie Bell made and looked around at the house, and at the child, and at the two of them, and he said, "I remember when Hugh Turner was a man who came through town 4 times a year, and nobody was sure he spoke more than 30 words at a stretch. Look at him now." Hugh Turner, who was standing at the door with James on his shoulder in the specific arrangement that James had established as his preference, said, "The right person changes the calculations." Cord laughed and shook his head. "That it does," he said, "that it does. After Cord left, Maggie Bell said 30 words at a stretch. Was that accurate? Hugh Turner considered. 25 maybe. I didn't have a lot to say to most people. And now, she said. He looked at her with that steady, warm regard. Now I have someone worth saying things to. Old Jeremiah Potts recovered fully from his chest sickness by the spring of 1884, and was at their wedding, and was at James's baptism. A small, wiry man of 68 who had decided that, since Maggie Bell had worked so hard to keep him alive, he owed it to her to get full use of the life she had preserved. He came to the house once a month or so, and sat in their main room, and told James elaborate stories about his early years in Kansas, which had been genuinely adventurous, and which James received with the same serious, wide-eyed attention that he gave to everything. In the summer of 1886, when James was 14 months old and had recently added walking to his considerable list of accomplishments, and was applying this skill to the project of reaching everything that was currently out of his reach, Maggie Bell discovered she was expecting again. She told Hugh Turner on the porch in the evening, watching the last light going gold and then pink over the tallgrass prairie that rolled away from their house in every direction, and he pulled her back against him, her back to his chest, his arms around her, and she felt him breathe and said, "2 children in a limestone house on the Kansas plains. I had not exactly pictured this life." "Is it not what you wanted?" he asked quietly. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. She thought about St. Louis and about the life she could have had there, the narrower and more comfortable and more predictable life. And she thought about the life she had chosen, which had been cold and hard and lonely until it wasn't. And she thought about Hugh Turner's hands on her, and James's serious gray eyes, and the carved wooden box on her shelf, and the quilt, the first quilt, still folded at the foot of their bed because she had told him she was keeping it, and he had seemed to understand exactly why. "It's more than I wanted," she said. "It's more than I knew how to want." He held her more firmly, and they watched the light change over the prairie and the hawks circle in the last of the warm air, and she thought there was no description adequate to what she felt in that moment, no clinical language and no sentimental language, only the fact of it, large and warm and sure. The second baby was a girl, born in March of 1887, and she arrived in a more leisurely fashion than her brother had, taking her time about the whole enterprise in a way that suggested from the very beginning that she would do things on her own schedule. They named her Anna, which was Hugh Turner's mother's name, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's directness of gaze. And from the first weeks, she studied Hugh Turner with an expression that was so uncannily like her father's own habitual assessment of the world that Maggie Bell would sometimes catch the two of them looking at each other and feel something so tender it was almost painful. James was 2 years old when Anna arrived and received her with the same seriousness he brought to all new information, observing her for several long minutes when Hugh Turner brought him in to meet her, and then patting her head very carefully with one small hand, which Maggie Bell thought was about as good as it was going to get from a 2-year-old, and which it was. The cold seasons came and went, year after year, and each one brought Maggie Bell to her clinic and her patients and brought Hugh Turner to his hills and his land, and each one ended with them both home in the limestone house with its thick walls and its good fire, with the children growing in the way that children do, faster than you are ready for, and in directions you did not predict. Maggie Bell's practice grew. By 1888, she was treating patients from farms and homesteads across a 50-mile radius, sometimes riding out alone and sometimes with Hugh Turner, who had become over the years a capable assistant, not in the clinical sense but in the practical one, the person who kept the horse steady and held the lantern and carried the bag and handled every logistical difficulty so that she could do the actual medical work. He had also, she had discovered, developed a real knowledge of plant medicines over his years in the hills, Things he had learned from the land and from time and from the specific necessity of keeping himself healthy and functional in isolated places. And she found his knowledge useful and interesting, and added it carefully to her own. They argued sometimes, because they were both people of strong convictions, and neither of them was inclined to yield simply for the sake of peace. But their arguments were clean, meaning that they were about the actual thing, and not about everything that had accumulated underneath it. And they always found their way through to the other side, sometimes quickly and sometimes slowly, but always through. And she thought that was the thing about two people who were genuinely honest with each other. The way through was always findable, even when the terrain was difficult. In the fall of 1889, Kansas became a proper state rather than a territory, which was a thing that had been coming for a long time and which changed some things about daily life and not others. Caldwell grew and changed as the years went on, the cattle trade that had made it wild and profitable shifting and settling into something more agricultural and more permanent. And the town became something more like what it would be for the next generation, more settled and more structured, though it kept something of its quality, the directness and the self-reliance that came from having been built by people who had to figure out everything from first principles. Maggie Bell watched these changes with interest and adapted to them, and was, by the early 1890s, regarded as one of the fundamental institutions of the region, a woman whose skill and presence had saved more lives than could be easily tallied, and who had done it with a directness and competence that had long since converted even those who had been skeptical in 1881. She had trained two younger women in recent years, one of whom was now practicing independently in a town 30 miles north, and she thought about Dr. Amherst in St. Louis who had trained her, about the way knowledge moved forward in this way, hand to hand through time, and she was glad. Hugh Turner remained essentially himself through all of this, which was one of the things she loved most about him. He did not become more civilized in the way that some people meant the word. He did not become smaller or more careful or more concerned with what the town thought, but he did become more rooted, in the way that a tree becomes more rooted, not by changing its nature, but by growing deeper into the ground it had chosen. He knew every foot of the land around their house, and for miles in every direction, and he managed it with the combination of knowledge and respect that was his fundamental relationship with the natural world. He taught James this, spending hours and then days walking the land with his son and showing him how to read it, and James took to it with the same serious intensity he brought to everything, so that by the time he was 8 years old, he knew the hawks individually and could find water in a dry year, and understood the tall grass in the way that his father had been learning to understand it for decades. Anna took after her mother in ways that delighted Maggie Bell and occasionally alarmed Hugh Turner, not because he did not admire Maggie Bell's qualities, but because he had a fairly clear idea of what life was going to be like for a woman with Anna's particular brand of certainty about herself and her own opinions. When he said this to Maggie Bell, she laughed and said, "She'll do fine. The world is going to have to catch up with her, that's all." And she said it with the confidence of a woman who had personal experience of the proposition. The quilt from the first night, the one from October of 1883, the buffalo hide and wool one that had started all of it, stayed folded at the foot of their bed for the entire span of their life in the limestone house. Maggie Bell had other quilts now, warmer and finer ones, including several that Hugh Turner had made over the years because he had never entirely stopped making them, but she would not part with the first one. Hugh Turner understood this. He understood it the way he understood most things about Maggie Bell, completely and without requiring an explanation, though she gave him one anyway one winter evening when they were sitting by the fire, and she had taken it out to look at it. "This is the beginning," she said. "This is the thing you did before you knew what it was going to become, before either of us did. That matters to me." He looked at the quilt and looked at her. "It matters to me too," he said. I put a lot of myself into it. It was all I had to give at the time, and I couldn't even give it directly." "You gave it," she said. "That was enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I thought about on those walks back to the hills? In the mornings after I'd left it." "Tell me," she said. "I thought about whether you had found it yet, whether you were warm. And then I thought about you going through your day, doing your work, and I didn't know anything specific about you. I had barely spoken to you, but I thought, she is in that building doing something difficult and important, and I hope the day is going well for her. Every morning, that's what I thought." She reached across and took his hand, the large, warm, familiar hand that she had been holding for years, and she held it. "It was going well," she said. "And then it got better." In the spring of 1892, when James was almost 7 and Anna was 5, Maggie Bell and Hugh Turner walked the property boundary together the way they did sometimes, all the way around the perimeter of the land they had made their life on, the limestone house at the center of it, and the tall grass prairie stretching away in the afternoon light. They walked without much talking, which was a comfortable silence because it was the silence of two people who had said most of what needed saying and knew the rest was understood. At the top of the small rise at the east edge of the property, where you could see the land rolling away toward Caldwell in one direction and toward the Flint Hills in the other, Maggie Bell stopped and stood for a moment looking at all of it, and Hugh Turner stopped beside her, and she felt the warmth of him at her shoulder the way she had felt the warmth of the first quilt, something specific and intentional and entirely reliable. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead," he said. "Are you happy? Truly, this life, this town and this house and the children and all of it? I know it isn't exactly what your life was before." He was quiet for a moment in the considering way, and she waited because she had learned that his silence was not avoidance but the opposite of it. It was the sign that he was taking her question seriously enough to answer it honestly. "I used to think," he said, "that what I needed was to be out there." He gestured toward the hills, the deep country, the places he still went and still loved. "I thought needing anything else was a kind of weakness, a compromise of what I was. And now," she said. "Now I think I was half a thing," he said. "Knowing the land and knowing how to live in it, that's real, I don't give that up. But I was only going outward. I was never coming home." He paused. "You are the home I was missing. You and James and Anna and this house on this ground. It turns out you can know the wilderness and love it and also have a home. I didn't know that before you." She put her arm through his and leaned against him, and they looked at the land together in the late afternoon light, and she thought that the world was very large and very old and they were small in it, and for a short time, the time of their lives together, it was extraordinarily good. They walked back down to the house in the golden light of the spring evening, and they could see Anna in the yard chasing something, possibly a chicken, with an expression of total commitment, and James sitting on the fence watching this with his characteristic grave assessment, and the smoke from the chimney rising straight up into the still air, and the limestone walls of the house solid and pale in the evening light. The house that Hugh Turner had built with his own hands, because someone he loved needed walls thick enough to hold warmth. He had been leaving quilts in the dark before dawn for someone he barely knew, walking 5 miles in the cold because a woman who did important work was cold, and that was not acceptable to him. She had been a woman alone in a drafty building at the edge of a rough town, doing the work because it could not be left undone, and because she was the only one willing and able to do it. Neither of them had been looking for the other. Both of them had found exactly what they needed. Maggie Bell picked up Anna, who had abandoned the chicken project and was now applying her considerable will to being carried, and held her against her hip, and Hugh Turner lifted James off the fence and put him on his shoulder as he always did, and they went inside together, into the warmth of the house, the fire already burning because Hugh Turner had banked it before they left, because that was what he did, because it was cold season and someone he loved needed to be warm. And that was the first reason and the last reason and all the reasons he needed. The door closed behind them. Outside in the pale evening, the tall grass moved in the evening wind and the hawks settled in the last light, and the limestone house stood solid on the Kansas plains, warm inside, its chimney breathing steady smoke into the cold, clear air. A house built by a man who had learned that warmth shared is not warmth diminished but warmth multiplied. A house full of two people who had found each other in the slow way that the best things are found, in the dark before dawn, in the cold at a door. With something warm left between them before either one of them knew what it would become. The cold season would come again. It always came again. And every night of it, the fire would be lit and the quilts would be warm and the door would be shut against the dark. And Maggie Bell and Hugh Turner would be inside together, which was the thing that had started with one quilt left in the October cold and had grown, year by year, into the whole shape of a life. It was, by any measure she knew how to apply, more than enough. It was everything.